Major funding for the series, Louisiana, A History, was provided by the Foundation for Excellence in Louisiana Public Broadcasting and the State of Louisiana. Corporate funding was provided by Bank One, proud to celebrate Louisiana's diverse past and committed to investing in our state's future. Community Coffee, part of Louisiana's rich history. Since 1919, devoted to providing signature coffees to our communities. Additional funding was provided by the following history patrons, helping all citizens discover the extraordinary legacy of Louisiana and its people.
In the hard years following the Civil War, Louisiana was left broken and baffled by the task of creating an entirely new social and political order for herself. Longtime leaders saw their tremendous wealth and power abruptly snatched from them, and a people, enslaved for generations, were suddenly faced with unfamiliar new rights, new responsibilities, and new roles. The troubles facing Louisiana were overwhelming. Even worse, however, were the solutions imposed by some people.
I always say that for Louisianians, the old adage that violence doesn't solve anything was nonsense. In their view, violence solved problems permanently.
In the years to come, politicians would fan the flames of racial hatred in order to keep blacks and poor whites divided.
Race trumps everything else. Class issues, economic issues, they all pale in comparison.
Louisiana had no shortage of villains in those days. Yet somehow, she managed to nurture and sustain her share of true visionaries.
Louisiana, following Reconstruction, was really in a time of incredible artistic ferment.
An artistic ferment that created a new, uniquely American form of self-expression.
The music really, in a true sense of the word, jazz, came to represent the hopes, the aspirations, and the celebratory nature of people in Louisiana.
It was a time in which Louisiana was reinventing herself, a transformation that was often painful and sometimes cruel, driven by a desperate need to find order in a world of chaos.
The years following the Civil War and Reconstruction were difficult ones for Louisiana. The horror of human bondage had been replaced by political and economic enslavement for blacks and poor whites alike. Corrupt politicians and the wealthy elite exploited the troubles of this time and steered the state on a course toward racial violence. But somehow, amid this social turmoil, the cultural life of Louisiana flourished and gave the nation a heritage of extraordinary literature, art, and music.
It is not quite accurate to say that we're at peace. What peace is it? The peace of a slumbering volcano.
On Monday morning, July 30th, 1866, dawn poured a stifling heat over the city of New Orleans. By mid-afternoon, the mercury would climb to 99 degrees. But the social climate of the city was about to reach the boiling point. An incensed mob of white citizens surrounded the Mechanics' Institute building, which served as Louisiana's state house after the Civil War. Inside, the convention delegates, men who'd supported the North in the war, had gathered to rewrite the state's constitution. They were determined to demolish the old Louisiana and reconstruct a new one. They planned to give black men the right to vote and take that right away from anyone who had supported the Confederacy. That meant the majority of white voters. Out on the street, a group of black Civil War veterans arrived on the scene. Shouts and insults turned to scuffling and rock throwing. Then someone drew a pistol and fired. Pandemonium followed.
So the police and this big mob break through the doors, rush to the top of the stairs, and there's a crowded room full of people. The police pull out their weapons. People in the mob pull out their weapons, and they just bang, 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 empty their guns into the crowded room.
In those 2 hours of gunfire, the city of New Orleans saw more bloodshed than at any time during the war. An estimated 50 to 60 dead, and another 300 to 400 wounded, almost all of them black. The Confederates there may have taken off their uniforms, but it was clear now they'd never really surrendered. When Confederate leaders came home from the war, many returned to the same old positions of power that they'd held before. Republicans and black legislators who had been installed under Union occupation were now voted out. Their work was dismantled, and harsh new laws were passed to restrict the freedom of blacks. More and more, the new reconstructed Louisiana was starting to look an awful lot like the old one.
Whenever you ask a group of people to change, as the North was requiring of white Southerners, to change the way they deal with things in their everyday lives, everyday encounters with black people, whenever you ask something like that, there is going to be heavy-duty resistance, and there was.
The moderate Reconstruction policies of Presidents Lincoln and Johnson had already begun to fray. The uprising in New Orleans unraveled them altogether.
The 1866 riot is extremely important in shaping what happens in Reconstruction, because many in the North are watching Louisiana and the other southern states, seeking signs that the former Confederates had accepted the reality of defeat.
When the Republican Congress convened in December of 1866, it seized control of Reconstruction from President Johnson.
There is anger in the North. Many of the North's sons had died in the war. Therefore, we're going to make these people pay. We're going to teach them a lesson that they will never forget so that they'll never try this again. We're going to punish them, and that was a fundamental aspect of radical Reconstruction.
Retribution aside, Northern Republicans also feared that the rights and even the lives of Southern Unionists and freedmen were in danger of being extinguished. Once again, Louisiana found itself under martial law and occupied by the Union Army. This time, it was under the command of General Philip Sheridan. Sheridan ordered the removal from power of many state and local officials, including the governor. The people who had elected them were outraged.
The South became the only part of the country, the only part of the United States ever to be occupied by a foreign, quote-unquote, army.
Known as Radical Reconstruction, the policies of the next 10 years were meant to tear down the social structures that had existed in Louisiana since its founding. To establish this, Louisiana would need a new constitution, one that granted black men the right to vote.
The Constitution of 1868 was probably one of the most far-reaching and liberal constitutions to be introduced in America at that time.
The black voters came from the quarters, from the cane fields, the cotton fields. They got up early in the morning and walked long distances during the day, in the heat of the day, in the sun, in the rain, to exercise their right to vote.
Some, however, would lose this privilege. The new Constitution went further than most Southern states in stripping ex-Confederates from voting rolls. The majority of the voters now were people of color.
They were assisted by a large influx of northern white men called carpetbaggers who came down to the South to take advantage of the depressed economic conditions that existed here.
Many carpetbaggers were indeed driven by greed. others by a genuine desire to bring progress to the South. And for still others, those two motives were entirely complementary.
Carpetbaggers dominate Louisiana to a greater degree than they do any other state. Not only are both of the governors under radical Reconstruction carpetbaggers, but 10 of the congressmen elected during Reconstruction are carpetbaggers. Carpetbag rule is a myth in some states. In Louisiana, it is no myth.
The world had been turned upside down. White men whose families had ruled the state for generations were removed from government and replaced by blacks and strangers from the North.
White men must understand how the time has changed. We now have the ballot to use in our own behalf. We have more than the ballot. We compose a majority in the state. The colored masses are the masters of the field.
When the Louisiana legislature assembled in 1868, it was different from any other in the state's history before or since. Almost a third of the House of Representatives and nearly 1/5 of the Senate were black.
This was something that was unseen and unheard of, and probably for most people unthought of before that time. And it meant that individuals who were involved in the political game in Louisiana had to reckon with not only black folk as voters, but black folk as players in the game, so that it was a different hue around the table when people sat down to make public policy.
Generally, the interests of the old Confederacy were represented by the Democrats. Blacks, Unionists, and carpetbaggers from the North fell in with the party of Lincoln, the Republicans.
The black voters didn't have any party to go to other than the Republican Party. And the number of white Republicans was relatively small compared to white Democrats. So the white Republicans, who often assumed a leadership role in party politics, depended on black votes for their success.
The political leaders that were produced by the black community were men of vision and of foresight, and men who had capabilities and qualities that also may have been feared by some within the community.
Indeed, even their political enemies begrudgingly acknowledged the impeccable honesty of leaders like Oscar Dunn, Louisiana's first black lieutenant governor. Their boss, on the other hand, did not enjoy such a squeaky clean reputation.
If there were anyone who came close to being a true carpetbagger, the old idea of, an adventurer, of coming from the North to the South to take advantage of the people during a time of distress, Warmoth fits that description pretty well.
As a young lieutenant colonel in the Union Army, Henry Clay Warmoth had served in New Orleans during the occupation. The Army eventually left. Warmoth didn't. Instead, he decided to stay in Louisiana to seek his fortune. Within 3 years, he'd found it. Warmoth was elected governor of Louisiana at age 26. It was a job few men would have wanted. New Orleans was bankrupt. The region's rich farmlands were blighted and idle. There were no major industries to manufacture goods, and little more than a few miles of railroads remained intact. Among all the hardships that Louisiana faced, however, none was more menacing than the violence visited upon the state by her own people.
Reconstruction is going to fail in Louisiana largely because Louisianians are willing to employ unprecedented levels of violence to destroy the Republican government and those that support it in the state of Louisiana.
By the fall of 1868, white supremacists and embittered Confederates had organized themselves into secret paramilitary units, like the Knights of the White Camellia.
And they were attempting to regain power through whatever means that they had at their disposal. And one of the means that they had at their disposal was, of course, terror.
In 1868 alone, state officials tallied the number of lives lost to terrorism in Louisiana at 784. A federal investigation counted more than 1,000.
Dick Sprawls said that I would get a bullet through me if I voted the Republican ticket, or I'd be driven from home without anything to eat and be liable to be bushwhacked. I voted the Democratic ticket only to save the lives of myself and my family.
To contend with this election tampering, the Republican government established a committee called the Returning Board to investigate fraud.
In essentially every election that occurred during Reconstruction, the Democrats practiced violence and intimidation against the voters to ensure that they would secure victory in the election, and the Republicans used the mechanism of the Returning Board to throw out election results that were unfavorable to their cause. So that in every election we see in Louisiana, to this day, it's very difficult to determine who actually won.
The possibility seemed quite real that Louisiana might soon be awash in anarchy. Governor Warmoth tried to reduce partisan tensions and violence by appeasing angry white Democrats. He appointed former Confederates to important positions in the state government and eventually restored the vote to them. But in the end, Warmoth only succeeded in widening the political divide.
For the appointment of men of color, I was denounced by the opposition as trying to Africanize the state. And for the appointment of conservative white men, I was denounced by the pure radicals as trying to sell out the Republican Party to Democrats.
Factional fighting within the Republican Party eventually led to the impeachment of Governor Warmoth. His successor was P.B.S. Pinchback, the only black man to ever occupy the governor's office in Louisiana. He led the state for 35 days.
In Louisiana and Reconstruction, nobody ever has control of the situation. The factions within the Republican Party are always battling with one another. The white Democrats refuse to accept the very existence of African American political participation. They see Republicans as hopelessly controlled by blacks and outsiders, and therefore never will accept their legitimacy to hold office.
The outcome of the 1872 election was a complete breakdown of political legitimacy. The Democrats stole the election for their candidate, John McHenry. The Republicans stole it back for theirs, William Pitt Kellogg. Both men claimed the election, and both were sworn in as governor of Louisiana. For the next 2 years, Louisiana would have two separate hostile state governments, each with its own legislature, officials, and more ominously, its own armed militias.
The disputed election of 1872 is bizarre. It's like Reconstruction theater of the absurd.
In the end, the federal government declared carpetbagger William Kellogg the legitimate governor of Louisiana, for whatever that was worth.
By the time Kellogg takes over, the Republican Party has in essence been destroyed in Louisiana. I mean, Kellogg is kind of ruling the corpse of Republican Louisiana.
In the years to come, white supremacists and Democrats would wage an unrelenting guerrilla war aimed at overthrowing Kellogg's government. All order and restraint in Louisiana were finally breached, and a new wave of violence washed over the state. On Easter Sunday, 1873, armed whites set fire to the Grant Parish Courthouse in Colfax. Scores of black Republicans who had sought shelter there were slaughtered in a blaze of bullets and flames. Any power Governor Kellogg might have had in Grant Parish died with them, and the Democrats seized the government there.
The Colfax Massacre of 1873 is the single bloodiest day of Reconstruction. Indeed, it's probably the bloodiest day in the 400-year history of blacks in America.
More than half of the 105 confirmed dead were found in the ashes of the burned-out courthouse. The violence in Colfax and elsewhere in northern Louisiana shocked even former Confederates. Some white leaders who had fought for the independence and the honor of the South rejected the atrocities being committed in the name of those ideals. They now began to call for justice and equality for black Louisianians.
If you're looking for villains and you want to demonize all the Confederate leadership, you're making a mistake. Some Confederate leaders were willing to change with the changing times, and a good example is Pierre-Gustave Toussaint-Beauregard, the greatest of all Confederate generals to come from Louisiana.
I am persuaded that the natural relationship between the white and colored people is that of friendship, and that there is no prosperity for Louisiana which must not be the result of their cooperation.
Few white Louisianians would listen to the hero of Fort Sumter. Men who had marched behind him on the battlefields were now joining to form a new and very different army.
The White League starts in Opelousas in the Red River Valley in the spring of 1874 and spreads across the state to New Orleans. It's hard to separate the White League from the Democratic Party. The White League becomes the military arm of the Democratic Party.
The full might of that military arm struck in New Orleans later that year.
Kellogg is so weak that the White League in New Orleans think they can rout him and simply take over the government by coup d'etat. September the 14th, 1874, some 8,000 white leaguers take on 3,000 or 4,000 of Kellogg's black militia and the police in a pitched battle. And this is a pitched battle bigger than any battle in the Indian Wars, bigger than anything since the Civil War itself.
The Metropolitan Police had fought off coup attempts before, but not this time. The White League unseated the state's government and installed a new one. Within days, President Ulysses S. Grant ordered 6 Navy warships into the port of New Orleans. Federal troops began arriving the night after the battle. For all the bullets and bloodshed, the White League had succeeded only in turning New Orleans into an occupied city once more. Reconstruction would linger on for another 2 years in Louisiana, but eventually it too would be counted among the casualties at Liberty Place.
Something we don't hear a lot about, but one reason Reconstruction failed is because the North abandoned the South. Voters in the North lost interest, got distracted by their own problems, and basically said, do it on your own.
By now, only 3 states remained under federal occupation: South Carolina, Florida, and Louisiana. If Reconstruction had been wounded in battle in Louisiana, it was old-fashioned politics in Washington, D.C. that would finally put it out of its misery.
And it comes officially to an end, a crashing end, with the disputed presidential election of 1876 between the Republican Rutherford B. Hayes and the Democrat from New York, Samuel Tilden. And the end is a straight-up political deal in Congress between Southern Democrats, who broke with their Northern members of their party, and Northern Republicans, to allow the Republicans to put Hayes in the White House in return for withdrawing federal troops from the 3 states of the South where Reconstruction was still a going concern, and allow Democrats to assume the state house in those states.
In other words, white Democrats could have Louisiana and the other southern states back to govern as they pleased, as long as they helped put a Republican in the White House. Because of the cruelty and corruption of the period, the legacy of Reconstruction in Louisiana remains one of history's most hotly debated topics.
I think there was enough goodwill between slave owner and slave that after the war, they would have in common found a solution to the problem of what do we do. But they had too many meddlers and heavy-handed federal folks.
Had the slave owners and former slaves been given the opportunity to work it out among themselves, they would have worked it out, but it would have been a system in which you would have had slave owners and you would have had slaves.
Reconstruction was a tragic and bloody failure in that Louisiana had its first opportunity to create a world of equality and a biracial political order, and it failed to do so. It left a heritage of hatred and mistrust that it's taken Louisiana a very long time to try to overcome, and a heritage of distrust that we still haven't overcome.
That nothing else can be said about Reconstruction. We have the 13th, 14th, and 15th Amendments on the books, which ended slavery, granted citizenship, and also the right to vote.
Despite the trouble that we had during that period, we have come together in many ways today that I think people would have found simply unbelievable in that period of trouble.
Trust to honor, and we who bear the grand old name of gentlemen will show you how great a victory your defeat has been.
After the federal government withdrew its troops from the state in 1877, Louisiana fell once again into the hands of those who had piloted it through generations of slavery and headlong into civil war.
For the Democratic Party, they declare themselves the victors of Reconstruction. They declare themselves the savior of Louisiana from outside rule, from corruption, and most importantly, from the domination of blacks. And that memory then becomes almost a weapon that the Democratic Party can use in any crisis throughout the remainder of the century and well into the 20th century.
The old wealthy planters and the nouveau riche who saved Louisiana from Reconstruction called themselves Redeemers. Others called them Bourbons, after the ultra-conservative monarchs who reclaimed their thrones following the French Revolution. When they returned to power, these New World Bourbons set out to do a little reconstruction of their own.
One of the primary goals of white Southerners after the Civil War was to, as much as possible, reestablish slavery without actually establishing slavery.
Although plantation owners could no longer buy slaves, they could now rent prisoners, usually black men, through a scheme called convict leasing.
This was apparently much worse than slavery because, of course, the lessor, has no financial interest in the convict. And as one person wrote in their diary, if one dies, I just get another. This system didn't end until early in the 20th century. This was a very, very evil system.
Another substitute for slave labor was sharecropping.
The colored people works for shares of the crop. 1/3 they makes, and their employers find them something to eat and farming utensils, giving them rations for man and wife. The white people rob the colored people out of 2/3 of what they make.
Plantations desperately needed field hands, and former slaves needed jobs. So a system evolved whereby landowners would provide an acreage for workers to farm and a place to live. The landowners sold the crops and paid the workers a fraction of the profit. For white planters, bankrupted by the war, sharecropping was the only solution.
Which I might add was something that blacks were somewhat in favor of too. I mean, it wasn't simply a program that was imposed on blacks by whites. It was something that was in many ways mutually acceptable.
Black Louisianians saw sharecropping as an intermediate step toward buying their own property. But dependent on the plantation's company store for their basic needs, sharecroppers were often exploited by outrageous charges and interest rates.
I think blacks didn't realize that it was going to have the implications that it would over a period of years, and essentially establish a chain of poverty that would be almost impossible to break. Something that's forgotten too, though, is that there were a significant number of whites who became involved in sharecropping, and they were just as entrapped by this system as blacks were.
We declare emphatically that the interests of the white and the colored races in the South are identical. Equal justice and fairness must be accorded to each.
Since the start of Reconstruction, racism had been a sharp tool in the hands of those who would undercut any alliance between blacks and whites. But by the 1890s, that tool had started to lose its edge as the poor of both races united to support political candidates rivaling the Democrats. The aristocratic Bourbons realized that they would have to concede something to poor whites in order to divide them from blacks.
And that something that was given to them was Jim Crow, segregation, the concept that white skin gave those individuals a place of preference in society from the cradle to the grave.
This was the logic that would guide much of Louisiana's politics well into the next century.
Race trumps everything else. Class issues, economic issues, they all pale in comparison to race as the dominant factor in determining how people voted, what they thought, what they did.
Some segregation of the races had always been a part of life in Louisiana, whether by law or custom. But challenging those laws and customs was also a time-honored tradition here, especially among the Black Creole community. One of the first so-called Jim Crow laws passed in Louisiana required that whites be granted their own passenger cars on trains, separate from blacks. Seeking to prove the law unconstitutional, black activists in New Orleans formed the Comité des Citoyens, or Citizens Committee. The group carefully constructed a test case. It was one of the first such challenges ever mounted anywhere in America. Homer Plessy would be the man chosen to defy the legal stronghold of white supremacy. And all he had to do was buy a ticket to ride.
Homer Plessy could pass for white. And what they did is they put Plessy on a railroad car in Covington. And then other members of the committee purposefully informed the white conductor, don't you know this person is Negro or colored? So he could be thrown off the car so that his ticket into this car would be an abrogated contract.
In what would become the most important legal challenge to ever come from Louisiana, the case went to the United States Supreme Court. Plessy's attorneys claimed that his 14th Amendment right to equality before the law had been violated. They argued that there could not be different categories of citizenship for Americans. The Supreme Court did not agree. In 1896, they ruled that the notion of separate but equal was a suitable means of addressing the question of race in America.
That is inequality in itself, and few people were willing to stand up and say it when it should have been said from the moment that the ink dried on the pages of the Supreme Court decision.
Homer Plessy had lost his case. In coming years, blacks would lose even more, including the right to vote. Bourbon lawmakers in Louisiana and throughout the South amended their constitutions in order to make it virtually impossible for blacks to qualify for voting.
The black vote, literally within roughly about an 8-year period, declined by 99%. There were approximately 145,000 black voters in 1896 before the disfranchisement laws are enacted. By 1904, after the disfranchisement laws, poll tax, literacy requirements, you had roughly about 1,500 black voters in the entire state. I mean, it's just overwhelming.
The object was to eliminate the vote of the ignorant and debased Negro population, and do it by such legislation as would be efficient and in accordance with the demands of enlightened statesmanship.
But what gets lost sometimes in the shuffle is that not only were blacks removed from the voting rolls, but so were whites.
In 1897, there were some 164,000 white men registered to vote in Louisiana. By 1904, that number would sink to 91,716. Those who dropped from the rolls were mostly farmers and sharecroppers. It seemed that blacks and many poor whites now had yet another thing in common. Politically, they were powerless.
There's no news here except yellow fever and politics, and I don't know which is the greater curse. I prefer the fever.
Politicians realized that Louisiana had plenty of other things worth stealing besides votes, like money. And the best way to take people's money was to get them to hand it over freely. Of course, they didn't call it stealing. They called it a lottery.
The 19th century Louisiana Lottery was a private firm that had been given a monopoly on the numbers racket by the state legislature. They were notorious for paying off both sides of the aisle. Whether Republican or Democrat, it didn't make any difference. Whoever was in power was still beholden to the state lottery.
The corporation sold tickets nationwide, bringing in an estimated $20 to $30 million each year. Much less than half of that was paid out in prizes. That's why the Louisiana State Lottery Company could afford to make Louisiana's politicians the best bribe leaders in the country. At the center of the lottery's power was the state treasurer, an almost legendary rogue named Edward A. Burke.
He was, without question, one of the strongest figures during this period. And he's also, given the history of Louisiana, this may be an incredibly monumental achievement. He's probably the biggest crook the state has ever known.
Eventually, the federal government would bring down the lottery. As for Edward Burke, he disappeared in Honduras. An audit of the state treasury revealed that nearly $1.3 million had vanished with him. But while some got rich from stealing, others stubbornly insisted on doing things the hard way. That is, they made money by working for it.
The Iron Horse will speed its way from Shreveport to Louisville through Bossier Parish. The construction of the Shreveport and Arkansas Road will bring into market thousands of valuable acres of land. It's the earnest hope of the times that railroad construction has just begun in Bossier, and that in the course of a few years, every parish in North Louisiana will be traversed by several railways.
Investment in the railroad industry transformed rural Louisiana. Just as towns had sprung up along Louisiana's riverfronts in the century before, depot towns became vital ports along the state's growing stretch of railways.
The railroads were essentially built by national interests. The big railroad builders were the Goulds and the Fisk and the big-time investors. It was costly, but by the 1870s, railroads were pretty much crucial to transportation across Louisiana.
Most of Louisiana's people were desperately poor, but the land was rich in natural resources. This drew the attention of investors and entrepreneurs from the north.
In Louisiana and Mississippi especially, well over half of the firms operating in the lumber industry in Louisiana are owned outside of the region.
After exhausting the white pine forest of the Great Lakes, lumber companies moved into the Gulf Coast region, where there were vast virgin stands of longleaf pine and cypress trees, some of them centuries old. Within a few years, the state became the world's leading lumber producer. But the business brought here by the lumber companies came at a high price.
And the environmental consequences at a time when no one thought of reforestation were tremendous.
Along with the railroads and lumber companies, an entirely new industry surged forward in Louisiana. In 1901, outside the southwestern town of Jennings, Louisiana's first commercial oil well came in. Over the next 100 years, nothing else would change Louisiana's economy, culture, and landscape as much as this one discovery.
Before long, the oil industry centered around Shreveport, west of Shreveport, Caddo Lake, Pine Island, and those regions. And the big oil companies that came were associated with Standard Oil of New Jersey, which built a refinery in Baton Rouge in 1909.
It was the largest refinery in the world. Still, at the start of the 20th century, for all its natural resources, the state generally lacked the means to manufacture goods. Louisiana remained a place for outside economic powers to exploit for profit, just as it had been during colonial days.
It was economic incentive that brought them here, and they made money and sometimes left behind a wasteland.
Traditional crops like cotton and sugar were still grown in Louisiana, but advances in agriculture made it possible to cultivate a new cash crop, rice. Good rice harvests brought new farmers to Louisiana, and to the farmers already here, they brought solid profits.
Today, there are 25,000 settlers ready to tell you that it is the most prosperous portion of the South. Many of the poor Acadian natives who had not tilled this soil, had never attended school, and could not speak a word of English, are today wealthy farmers.
Beginning in the 1880s, Louisiana growers were joined by masses of Italian immigrants, primarily from Sicily. Many of these newcomers eventually moved to the cities, establishing themselves as leaders in the food distribution industry. While recent arrivals and longtime Louisianians alike struggled to transform their lives for the better, the Bourbon aristocrats continued to work hard to preserve a Louisiana whose time had long since passed. But now, slowly but surely, momentous changes were beginning to trickle through Louisiana.
Very many men and women soon realized the need of full suffrage for women. The day has dawned for women's full enfranchisement in Louisiana.
America's women did indeed win the right to vote in 1920, thanks in part to the efforts of New Orleans suffragists like Elizabeth Lyle Saxon, Carolyn Merrick, and the Gordon sisters Kate and Jean. With the ballot, they were more able than ever to hasten that onward march by pushing for progressive changes in Louisiana. Topping the long list of needed reforms was education.
One of the real tragedies of Reconstruction becomes the fact that the white conservative Democrats who take over in 1877 reduce dramatically spending for education, for blacks especially, but for whites as well. And that post-Reconstruction abandonment of public education, which I don't think is too strong a term to describe it, has tremendous implications for Louisiana throughout the 20th century, and my guess is into the 21st century.
Ironically, most of Louisiana's present-day colleges and universities were founded in the decades following Reconstruction. And with modest increases in funding for public education, under Governor Newton C. Blanchard, more students were prepared to enroll in those colleges. But if glimmers of progress had begun to dawn for some, life remained as bleak as ever for a great many more.
This is on the main line, tell him what you want. Oh, call it.
The more that was lost or taken from Louisiana's poor, the harder they clutched what fed their hopes.
So many of the people who lived on the earth had nothing else but to believe in religion. They surely had no money. Not after working all year. They had no money in the bank, anything like that. So God was the only thing that they did have.
Whether in cities or rural communities, in homesteads or former slave quarters, many people found comfort and solace in the world of the Spirit.
The church was right in the center of the quarters, and no matter where you were in the quarters where you lived, you could hear the singing, and you could hear the preaching and the praying.
In the years following the Civil War, Louisiana endured some of the darkest moments of her history, and yet, paradoxically, out of that darkness shone some of the most brilliant and beautiful expressions of her people's creativity.
Louisiana, following Reconstruction, was really in a time of incredible artistic ferment. It seemed that practically everyone who wasn't painting was writing, or who wasn't writing was painting. Suddenly, the landscape makes it onto canvas. I think it's partly that people at that point saw landscape as actually beautiful, as something to like, as something picturesque, something you'd like to look at in your house.
Painter Richard Clegg, a native of the state, was among the most noteworthy of the new landscape painters. Louisiana's natural beauty, as well as her commercial advantages, were given an international showcase in 1884, when New Orleans hosted the World's Industrial and Cotton Exposition. Although it failed to turn a profit, the fair proved to be a spectacular cultural triumph, exposing local writers and artists to a national audience. Among the millions of visitors drawn to the exposition from around the globe were two brothers from New England.
Ellsworth and William Woodward both looked at New Orleans, at Louisiana, at the Gulf Coast, at their larger environment, with very new eyes. And they started to see beauty in things that really were not widely painted before.
The Woodward brothers moved here and founded the Newcomb School of Art, an important mainstay of the arts and crafts movement. Today, Newcomb pottery is prized throughout the world for its beauty and craftsmanship. The most famous artists working in New Orleans during this period came to spend time with his Creole cousins.
I think the work that Degas did here in his 1872 visit is some of his best.
Just as the beauty of Louisiana had fixed the gaze of painters and potters, writers were inspired to sketch the region's colorful characters. The mix of races and cultures, spirituality and sensuality. It was all an irresistible attraction to literary figures like Mark Twain, Lafcadio Hearn, and Kate Chopin. Some of the writers best suited to capturing the subtler shades of local color were natives such as Grace King, Alice Dunbar Nelson, and George Washington Cable. Almost a century after joining the United States, Louisiana still seemed like a foreign, faraway place to readers, and her people, the most exotic of Americans. Then, just as now, people came to New Orleans to soak in the sounds of America's most musical city.
New Orleans had just about every type of music imaginable, from opera, classical, European classical music, ethnic folk musics of all types, Africanized drumming, singing, and chanting, African American folk music, and there were also brass bands that were very popular from the French colonial days.
In turn-of-the-century New Orleans, those varied traditions and styles combined to create something entirely new, something that could only have happened in that place and at that time. The birth of jazz.
New Orleans had such a fertile climate for the development of jazz. It historically had the right combination of spirit, a history of celebration, and obsession with dancing, and a blend or combination of all different types of music.
Careless of the laws and conventions of the times, jazz transcended the disparities of race and culture by merging those differences into something that was neither wholly black nor white, European nor African.
What jazz musicians did was they found out that they could give the music new life, freedom, which is what the people were really looking for that created the music, a way of making the music more personal and using that personalized sound in unison with others who were also adding their own improvised personalized sounds to the music. So instead of just playing the music was loosened up and could be done like this.
Musicians and audiences looking for that new freedom and loosened up style of music usually found it in a part of the city called Storyville, a colorful neighborhood of whorehouses and juke joints where prostitution and gambling were legal. After the United States entered World War I in 1917, the Navy shut Storyville down, apparently for soldiers going off to face the horrors of war. The shady side of New Orleans was just a little too dangerous to their health and morals. But the spirit of Storyville survives in unnumbered musical geniuses. Buddy Bolden, Jelly Roll Morton, Kid Ory, and King Oliver. There was one, however, who became known the world over.
For all intents and purposes, Louis Armstrong is number one. I mean, whatever jazz you hear today is directly due to the contribution of Louis Armstrong.
The most distinctly American art form, jazz brought together and blended all that was best about the different peoples of Louisiana, and at a time when they were otherwise most divided.
The night cometh, in which we take no note of time, and forget that we are living in a practical age, which mostly relegates romance to printed pages and merriment to the state. And the glorious night is approaching, this quaint old-time night, star-jeweled, fantastically robed, and the blue river is bearing us fleets of white boats thronged with strangers, who will dance the dance of the carnival until blue day puts out at once the trembling tapers of the stars and lights of the great ball.
Throughout Louisiana's long history, and even in the hard years following the Civil War, nothing has ever managed to dampen the spirit of celebration that has made this people unlike any other Americans. But in the early days of the new century, that joie de vivre would be tested. Steady rains would start to fall, the river would begin to rise, and Louisiana would brace for the flood of changes rolling toward her. To learn more about Louisiana's rich history, visit us online at louisianahistory.org.
Major funding for the series, Louisiana, A History, was provided by the Foundation for Excellence in Louisiana Public Broadcasting and the State of Louisiana. Corporate funding was provided by Bank One, proud to celebrate Louisiana's diverse past and committed to investing in our state's future. Community Coffee, part of Louisiana's rich history. Since 1919, devoted to providing signature coffees to our communities. Additional funding was provided by the following history patrons, helping all citizens discover the extraordinary legacy of Louisiana and its people. To order a VHS or DVD set of the series, Louisiana, A History, or the companion book, Louisiana, An Illustrated History, call 1-800-973-7246 or write to the address on your screen.